Please comment where you are watching in the world. Please share your horror stories via our email or subreddit in the description. Thank you. A few months ago, I went through a bad breakup and I needed to move forward. So I downloaded the infamous Tinder. It wasn't my first time on the app, but I wasn't a pro and I have heard some stories, but I wanted to try again. My expectations were low, to say the least. I wasn't looking for my soulmate, just someone to chat with really. That's how I ended up matching with this guy called Tom. He looked nice and looked like a genuine guy, but I always go in with my guard up. We exchanged messages for a couple of days. The conversation wasn't life-changing, but it wasn't bad either. We talked about work, hobbies, the usual small talk. Looking back, I realize I made my first mistake when I casually mentioned where I worked. I didn't think much of it at the time. It's not like I gave him my exact schedule or anything. I was just answering one of his questions about my job. But now, I wince every time I replay that moment in my head, because that's when everything started to feel off. The same night I told him where I worked, something strange happened. I was at work, going about my usual routine, when I noticed a guy walk past the shop. He lingered just long enough for me to get a good look at him, and I swear he looked a lot like Tom. But here's the thing, I'd never actually met him in person, so I couldn't be 100% sure. Maybe it was him, maybe it wasn't. Either way, it felt weird. Why would he be in my area when he'd mentioned earlier that he lived on the other side of the city? I brushed it off, telling myself I was overthinking it. It's a big city, people get around. A coincidence, nothing more. But that little nagging feeling in the back of my mind wouldn't go away. A couple of days later, things got even weirder. It was a quiet evening at work, and my phone battery was on its last legs. I sent Tom a quick message letting him know I'd have to stop chatting for the night since my phone was about to die. I figured that would be the end of the conversation until I got home and charged it up again. Simple, right? Wrong. Not 10 minutes later, the door to the shop swung open, and there he was. Tom. I recognized him instantly from his profile pictures. He was holding something in his hand, and as he walked up to the counter, I realized it was an iPhone charger. I was stunned. I didn't even know how to react. On one hand, sure, it could be seen as a thoughtful gesture, if we'd actually met before or had some kind of established relationship. But this was downright bizarre. I hadn't even told him my phone was dying until a few minutes earlier. So how had he managed to show up so quickly? And why was he even in my area in the first place? I tried to keep my composure, but internally I was freaking out. I thanked him for the charger, awkwardly trying to mask my discomfort. He didn't stay long, just smiled, said something about wanting to make sure I wasn't stuck without a phone, and left. As soon as he was out the door, I made up my mind, this was too much. I needed to cut ties. But first, I had to return the charger. I didn't want any lingering connection to him. No reason for him to think we were still on good terms. When my shift ended, I messaged him and told him I'd drop it off. He said he'd be at a bar around the corner, so I reluctantly agreed to meet him there. When I walked into the bar, he was sitting by himself, looking way too pleased to see me. I handed him the charger, mumbled some excuse about needing to get home early, and left as quickly as I could. I thought that would be the end of it. I'd done what I needed to do. There was no reason for us to interact anymore. But then later that night, I made the mistake of looking at his Instagram. And that's when I saw it. A smiling selfie he'd posted earlier in the day with the caption, "I'm now a taken man, winky face." I stared at the screen in disbelief. Taken? By who? We'd barely spoken for a few days, and I'd only met him twice. Once when he randomly showed up at my workplace, and once when I returned the charger. How on earth could he think we were in a relationship? The realization sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't just weird anymore. It was unsettling. For the next few weeks, Tom's presence became an eerie constant in my life. Every time I finished work, there he was, casually walking past the shop, always alone, always at the exact time my shift ended. He never came inside, never tried to talk to me again, but his timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. He knew my schedule. He was waiting for me. I started to feel paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting him to pop up wherever I went. It got to the point where I'd linger inside the shop after my shift ended, hoping to throw him off, or take a different route home just to avoid crossing paths with him. I didn't know what he wanted or what he was capable of, but I knew I didn't want to find out. Eventually, his appearances stopped. Maybe he got bored, or maybe he realized I wasn't interested. Either way, I was relieved. But the experience left me shaken. It made me question my own judgment. my own sense of safety. How had I let this happen? How had I given a stranger enough information to track me down and insert himself into my life? Looking back, I can see all the red flags I ignored in those early conversations. The way he seemed a little too eager, a little too intense. The way he'd steer the conversation back to me, asking questions that felt innocent at the time but, in hindsight, were probably calculated. I'd brushed it all off, telling myself I was being paranoid. But I wasn't. The whole ordeal was a wake-up call. It made me realize how easily we can let people into our lives without really knowing them, how much we take our own privacy for granted. It also made me more cautious about what I share, who I trust, and how I navigate the strange, messy world of online dating. I don't know what Tom's deal was. Maybe he was harmless, just an overly enthusiastic guy who didn't understand boundaries. Or maybe he wasn't. I'll never know for sure, and honestly, I'm fine with that. What I do know is that I'll never forget the way he made me feel. Like my life wasn't entirely my own anymore, like I was being watched. And that's not a feeling I'd wish on anyone. It started like most modern romances, or at least attempts at them, do nowadays. A swipe, a match, and a cheeky exchange of pleasantries on good old Tinder. She was hot, her profile exuding a confidence that felt magnetic. One of her pictures showed her laughing in what looked like a sunflower field, her hair catching the golden light just perfectly. Another was a bold, no-holds-barred close-up of her face, looking straight into the camera, her eyes daring anyone to underestimate her. Her bio read, in a tone both playful and firm, "No hookups." If you're looking for a one-night stand, keep swiping. It intrigued me. I mean, let me be honest here, a lot of people toss that line into their bios, and yet, there's often a contradiction between what's said and what happens. But something about her seemed genuine, like she meant it. She came across like someone who knew exactly what she wanted, and wasn't afraid to draw boundaries. I admired that. Swiping right felt natural. When we matched, I couldn't help but feel a little rush of excitement. Her first message was sharp and witty, which only amplified my interest. We bantered for a while. Nothing too deep, just the kind of light-hearted, flirty back and forth that keeps you smiling at your phone like an idiot. After a few days, we decided to meet up for drinks. She suggested a small bar downtown, one of those dimly lit spots with craft cocktails and an ambience that made you feel cooler just by being there. When I met her in person, she was even more captivating than her pictures suggested. Her voice had this melodic quality, and she was animated in a way that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. She was direct, too, which I found both refreshing and intimidating. Within the first 10 minutes of meeting, she reiterated her stance on hookups. "Just to be clear," she said, resting her glass on the table and leaning slightly forward, "I'm not looking for some meaningless fling. If that's what you're after, we can part ways now." I assured her I wasn't, though, in hindsight. Maybe I wasn't entirely sure what I was looking for at the time. We laughed, we talked, and by the second round of drinks, we were already teetering on tipsy. She had this infectious energy, the kind of charisma that made you feel like you were in the presence of someone extraordinary. I found myself leaning closer, hanging on her every word, and before I knew it, we were several drinks deep. That's when it happened. "Want to come back to mine and put your penis in my vagina?" she asked, her tone casual, as though she were asking if I wanted to split an appetizer. For a moment, I thought I misheard her. I mean, how do you respond to that? But the way she looked at me, half challenging, half amused, made it clear she wasn't kidding. I laughed, not quite sure if it was out of nervousness or disbelief. And then, well, I said yes. Her apartment was small but cozy, with mismatched furniture that somehow worked together, and a faint lavender scent hanging in the air. We stumbled through the door, still giggling about something nonsensical, and before long, we were tangled up in each other. It was fun, passionate, a little clumsy in that way drunken hookups tend to be. But then, just as things were picking up pace, she said it. "Oh, I love you," she whispered, her voice breathy and urgent. "Do you love me too?" I froze. My brain scrambled to process what she'd just said, but no coherent thoughts came to mind. I mean, what do you even say to that? I'd known her for hours? Maybe 5? I didn't reply. I couldn't. Instead, I did what any rational person in that moment would do. I focused on the task at hand. Concentrate. I thought, willing myself to stay in the moment and not let her words derail what was otherwise a very enjoyable experience. The night ended, and I woke up the next morning with a slight headache and a lingering sense of confusion. She was still asleep beside me, her hair a chaotic mess spread across the pillow, her face peaceful. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of affection. But then the events of the previous night came flooding back, and that affection was quickly replaced by unease. Love? Already? Was it the alcohol talking, or was she serious? Either way, it was a lot. I tried to shake it off as I got dressed, and quietly slipped out of her apartment, leaving a note on her kitchen counter that read, "Had a great time. Text me later." I figured that would buy me some time to process everything. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly things would escalate. By the time I got home, she'd already texted me 3 times. The first was a simple good morning smiley face, which I thought was sweet. The second was a little more intense. "Last night was amazing. I feel like we have such a deep connection already." The third, sent about 10 minutes after the second, read, "I honestly feel like you could be the one. I've never felt this way about anyone before." I stared at my phone, unsure how to respond. It wasn't that I didn't like her. I did, but this was moving at warp speed, and I barely had time to catch my breath. I decided to keep things light and replied with something non-committal like, "Yeah, last night was fun. Let's hang out again soon." That turned out to be the wrong move. She called me immediately, her voice brimming with excitement. She wanted to know when we could see each other again, what my long-term goals were, and wait for it, how I felt about having kids someday. I tried to steer the conversation back to lighter territory, but she was relentless. By the end of the call, I felt like I'd been through an emotional marathon. Over the next couple of days, things only got more intense. She texted constantly, alternating between sweet messages about how much she liked me and passive-aggressive jabs about how I wasn't as responsive as she'd like. If I didn't reply within an hour, she'd send follow-ups like, "Are you ignoring me?" Or, "If you don't want to talk, just say so." It was exhausting. The breaking point came when she showed up at my place unannounced, holding a bag of groceries and talking about cooking dinner together. I had barely rolled out of bed and wasn't exactly in the mood for company, let alone an impromptu date. When I gently suggested that she should have given me a heads up before coming over, she snapped. "You're so emotionally unavailable," she said, her voice rising. "Why are you even on Tinder if you're not ready for a real relationship? Do you just like wasting people's time? Do you get off on it or something?" I tried to explain that I wasn't against the idea of a relationship, but that I needed time to get to know someone before diving in head first. She wasn't having it. She called me selfish, immature, and a slew of other names that I won't repeat here. By the end of her tirade, I felt like I'd been hit by a freight train. After she left, I sat on my couch, staring at the wall and trying to make sense of what had just happened. It had been, 3 days since we met? In that time, I'd experienced more drama than I usually do in a year. It was too much, too fast, and I knew I couldn't keep up with her pace. For now, I decided to stick with the one thing I could count on myself. Sure, it's not as exciting as the thrill of meeting someone new, but at least it's drama-free. And honestly, after that whirlwind experience, drama-free sounded pretty damn good. There was this guy. Let me tell you, he was a solid 10 in his pictures, no joke. Perfect jawline that could cut glass, chiseled physique, and I can only imagine what else lies. Oh, how I could imagine. Moving on. He only had a few pictures, a short bio that read, "Looking for someone and something real," and some emojis that I assumed were meant to show he didn't take himself too seriously. I was intrigued. When he messaged me, my heart skipped not one, but 2 beats. It wasn't even one of those boring hey messages either. He opened with a funny comment about one of my pictures, something clever and specific enough to catch my attention. We started chatting, and within a few minutes, I was hooked. He was witty, quick, and flirty in a way that didn't feel forced. When he asked if I wanted to meet up for coffee, I didn't hesitate. Of course, I said yes. Who wouldn't, right? The day of the date, I was nervous but excited. I put some extra effort into my outfit, casual but cute, the kind of look that says, "Oh, this old thing?" I just threw it on. About an hour before we were supposed to meet, he messaged me and said, "Hey, can you pick me up?" At first, I was a little thrown off. I mean, it's not entirely unheard of, but it wasn't what I expected. Still, I figured maybe his car was in the shop or something. No big deal. I told myself not to overthink it. This guy was a 10, after all. If picking him up was the price of admission to what could be a great date, I was willing to pay it. I pulled up outside his place, and when he walked out, I was relieved to see that he looked just as good in person as he did in his pictures. Better, even. He had this relaxed confidence about him, the kind of vibe that makes you feel instantly at ease. He slid into the passenger seat, flashed me that killer smile, and said, "Thanks for picking me up. You're already my hero." We were supposed to grab coffee, but as we started talking, he suggested we get dinner instead. "I'm starving," he said, "and I feel like coffee won't do this justice. I want to actually sit and talk to you." It was smooth, and I was flattered. Dinner felt more intentional, more like a real date. So I agreed. We ended up at a cozy little Italian restaurant, the kind of place with dim lighting and checkered tablecloths. Over plates of pasta and glasses of wine, we talked and laughed like we'd known each other for years. He was funny, really funny. The kind of funny that makes you laugh so hard you forget to be self-conscious about it. He told me stories about his job, his friends, and his misadventures on dating apps, and I found myself leaning forward, hanging on every word. For a while, it felt like one of those magical, serendipitous dates you only see in rom-coms. After dinner, neither of us seemed ready for the night to end, so we decided to keep hanging out. We walked around for a bit, talking and joking, and then headed back to my car. That's when things started to take a turn. As we sat in the car, he pulled out his phone. "There's something I want to show you," he said, his tone suddenly more serious. I thought maybe it was a funny meme or a picture of his dog or something lighthearted. But instead, he opened a folder on his phone and said, "These are pictures of my son." I blinked, caught off guard. This was the first I'd heard about him having a kid. Not that it was a problem. It's just not something I was expecting to come up on our first date. He started scrolling through the folder, showing me photo after photo of his son. There were hundreds of them, maybe even more. Every picture came with a story. "This one was his first time at the beach," he said, his voice softening. "He loved the sand but hated the water." He scrolled to the next picture. "Oh, and this one. This was his first Halloween. He was a little pumpkin." He kept going, scrolling and narrating, and I didn't know how to react. On one hand, it was sweet how much he cared about his son. You could see it in his face, hear it in his voice. He loved that kid more than anything. But on the other hand, it was a lot. I mean, we were sitting in my car on our first date, and I was being given a comprehensive slideshow of his child's life. It felt intense. It didn't stop at pictures, either. He had videos, too. "You've got to see this," he said, pulling up a clip of his son taking his first steps. He was so wobbly, but he was determined. I was so proud of him. He smiled at the screen, and for a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. This guy clearly missed his son. As he explained, his son's mom had taken off to Washington. He didn't know where exactly, and he hadn't seen his kid in months. You could tell it was eating him up inside. I felt for him, I really did. But at the same time, I couldn't help but think, why are you telling me all of this on a first date? He kept scrolling through the folder, showing me more pictures, more videos, more stories. I nodded and smiled politely, not wanting to seem insensitive, but internally I was starting to feel trapped. The car suddenly felt smaller, like the air was being sucked out of it. I found myself glancing at the clock, wondering how much longer this was going to last. After what felt like an eternity, he finally put his phone away. I let out a silent sigh of relief, thinking maybe we could salvage the rest of the night. But then he started talking about his ex. He didn't just mention her in passing, either. He went into detail. He told me about their relationship, how it fell apart, how she left with their son, and how he was doing everything he could to track them down. It was heavy, too heavy for a first date. By this point, I was emotionally drained. I felt like I'd just been through an entire therapy session, only I wasn't the therapist. I was the unwilling participant. I tried to steer the conversation back to lighter topics, but it was no use. He was on a roll, and there was no stopping him. Eventually, the night came to an end. As I dropped him off at his place, he gave me a hug and said, "Thanks for listening. I really needed that." I smiled weakly and told him to take care, inwardly relieved that the date was finally over. I met this guy on Hinge. I wasn't immediately blown away by his page, but there was something refreshing about him. After all, I was used to seeing profiles full of guys flashing their abs, holding fish they'd caught, or trying way too hard to seem edgy. He felt safe. Vanilla, maybe. But sometimes vanilla is exactly what you want after dealing with rocky road. So when he messaged me, I was curious enough to reply. We chatted for a bit, and he was polite, which was such a relief. No weird pickup lines or unsolicited flirting, just normal, pleasant conversation. He told me about his dream of becoming a meteorologist and how fascinated he was by weather patterns. I remember thinking, okay, that's kind of nerdy, but in a cute way. The more we talked, the more I started to see his charm. He asked thoughtful questions, seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me, and didn't come across as pushy. So when he asked if I wanted to grab coffee, I agreed. Our first date was at a Starbucks, and to my surprise, it went really well. We talked for hours, about childhood memories, hobbies, family. He had this quiet, soft-spoken energy about him that made him easy to talk to. He wasn't trying too hard to impress me, which I appreciated. He even told me about how close he was to his grandfather, and how the man had been a major influence in his life. It was sweet, honestly. By the time we said goodbye, I was looking forward to seeing him again. For our second date, we went out for ice cream. Again, it was simple and low-key, which I liked. Fancy dinners and trying to wow someone right out of the gate can feel like too much pressure, but this was just easy. After we got our cones, we sat outside on a bench and chatted. The conversation was light and playful, and at one point, I made an offhand comment about how guys have obvious things to be attracted to, like boobs or butts, while girls tend to notice more random things like forearms or calves. I thought it was just a funny observation to keep the conversation going. But then his whole vibe shifted. He got this strange, almost nervous look on his face and said, "I don't know if I should tell you this." Naturally, my curiosity kicked in. "What is it?" I asked, laughing a little. "Come on, you can't just say that and not tell me." He hesitated for a few moments, clearly debating whether he should spill whatever secret he was holding on to. Finally, he took a deep breath and said, "Okay, I have a foot fetish." I blinked, caught off guard but not entirely shocked. Foot fetishes aren't exactly rare or anything. I'd heard about them before, and honestly, I was more curious than anything. "Okay," I said, trying to sound casual. "That's not that weird. I mean, lots of people have fetishes. So, what about feet is so appealing to you?" Once I opened that door, he walked right through it. And then some. He started explaining his fetish in detail, like a lot of detail. He told me what he liked about feet, how he'd always been drawn to them, and how he thought it had started when he was a kid. I listened, mostly out of curiosity, and even asked him questions. "Have you always felt this way? Is it like all feet or just certain types? Do you think it's genetic, or do you think something happened to make you this way?" He was surprisingly open, and honestly I was fascinated. But then I asked him a question that I thought was harmless at the time. Could you be with someone who wasn't into it? Like, what if they weren't comfortable with it at first, but grew to love you for other reasons? His answer caught me off guard. "No, I couldn't," he said bluntly. "I've tried, but I just can't. I've even called a girl from Backpage a couple of times because I couldn't take it anymore." I wasn't sure how to react to that. The fact that he was so upfront about it was something, I guess. But I still wasn't totally weirded out. Not yet. Then he asked, "Have you ever heard of a crush fetish?" I shook my head. "No, what's that?" He got this serious look on his face and said, "Don't Google it. It'll freak you out." That definitely got my attention. "Why not?" I asked. "What is it?" He explained that there are 2 levels to a crush fetish. Level 1 involved getting aroused by watching someone crush invertebrate animals under their feet, like bugs. I could feel my stomach turning as he spoke, but I forced myself to keep listening. At that point, I was too deep into the conversation to back out. He admitted that this was his fetish, watching bugs being crushed. Then he said, "Level 2 is where it gets really dark. That's when people get turned on by watching someone crush vertebrate animals like bunnies or kittens." I stared at him, trying to process what I had just heard. I couldn't believe we were sitting on a bench, eating ice cream, and having this conversation. It was surreal. And then, like a light bulb going off in my head, I remembered something he'd said on our first date. We had been talking about the summer heat and how it seemed to be bringing more bugs into my house. I had joked about how I'd been squishing bugs all day. At the time, he had laughed and said something like, "That really gets me going." I thought it was just an awkward joke and brushed it off. But now, with this new information, those words took on an entirely different meaning. And then there were the shoes. On our first date, he had casually asked me what kind of shoes I usually wear. Again, I didn't think much of it at the time and answered honestly. I happened to be wearing moccasins that day, and because I'm a pretty open person, I mentioned that they sometimes made my feet smell, which was why I didn't wear them often. He had laughed and said, "That's actually really hot. I'd love to smell your shoes if you'd let me." At the time, I thought he was just being quirky and playful. But now, sitting on that bench, everything was starting to click into place. As the date went on, he made more and more forward comments about what turned him on about me. Things I hadn't even realized I was doing, like the shoes I wore or the way I crossed my legs. It was becoming increasingly uncomfortable, and by the end of the date, I was ready to go home. A week or so later, I told him I had met someone else and thought it would be best to end our communication. He seemed to take it well at first, but then a few months later he started texting me again. He sent me 4 or 5 messages asking for my help. He said he'd pay me to let him do stuff with my feet. Long story here, I apologize. About 8 months ago, Tinder date. She suggests brunch at Max's Wine Dive on McKinney. We're in Dallas. I pick her up at the Arpeggio Apartments in Victory Park. She's not ready, so she buzzes me in. Her apartment is beautiful, lots of high-dollar stuff, no roommate. We go to Max's at 1 p.m. She drinks an entire bottle of champagne by herself. We leave, and in the car she says she wants to stop by a shop in West Village. I park in the parking garage and get out. I look for her and don't see her. I hear a noise, so I look around my car and she's squatting next to the wall peeing on the ground. We go into the shop. She takes a few dresses into the changing room and tells me to come over. I stand outside the changing room and she pulls me inside. She completely undresses, gets in the clothes, asks me what I think, undresses, gets in more clothes, etc. She takes about $1,500 worth of clothes to the counter and tells the cashier she really has to pee. Cashier says sorry. My date begs, so cashier relents and takes her into the back, but it's too late. The damage is done. She also buys a new pair of pants. On the way back to her apartment, she answers a call and starts talking in a foreign language that I can't place. Couldn't even guess the continent. She's very nervous and upset. She hangs up and tells me she has to go to her other apartment at the Cirque, also in Victory Park. She asks me to go in with her. We go into her apartment, which is also completely beautiful and belongs only to her. She has a badass telescope that I start playing with. In the mirror, I see her open a safe and put something in her purse. She tells me we need to leave and asks me to take her to my house. We go to my house and she instantly passes out. Stays passed out for about 6 hours. Wakes up, wants Dairy Queen. It's closed and she starts crying. I take her to Sonic. She gets a cheeseburger, a chili dog, cheese fries, and a sundae. We come home, she eats it and throws up. Passes out on my couch. I read and go to sleep. Next morning she asks if she can stay and watch football. I tell her I have plans and need to take her home. She says she can't go to either of her apartments. I tell her too bad, I have plans, and drop her off at Cirque. She texted asking when we could see each other again, but I never responded. Not much of a horror story, but I can say this is one I probably won't forget since I was actually scared for my life. Little background story of my life for the past 5 months. I've been having a lot of issues trying to sleep. Get into bed around October 11th, and I won't be asleep till about 3 to 5, constantly tossing and turning. So, I wouldn't call myself a Tinder addict, but I have been using it for quite some time, and actually have gone out on a lot of Tinder dates. I'm known as the Tinder veteran by my friends, and even my younger sister. Anyways, this guy and I matched probably 2 months ago now. We hit it off. And I would be a liar if I didn't say he was good looking in his pictures. We ended up texting and calling for about a week before deciding to meet in person. We ended up picking a day after I worked, and it was supposed to be a local bar close to where I work. Keep in mind I worked half an hour drive home work. So fast forward to the big day. I didn't end up sleeping till about 5 a.m. this day, and had to wake up to go to work at 7. Worked a full 12-hour day, and left work to meet with this guy. By this time I didn't realize how tired I actually was until I got to my car. I thought about texting him to ask to rain check as I really wanted to go home, and just lay down or take a bath. Instead I sucked it up, and went to go meet him at this bar, which was supposed to be 5 minutes away. Ends up being 15 minutes away from work and 45 minutes away from home. Ugh. I follow my Google Maps to a part of town I have never been to, arrive at the location, but end up soul-seeing the block 5 times cause there were 0 signs indicating that the bar was at this location. End up parking my car in this dimly lit parking lot, looking for this place. Scared shitless, I start thinking up of all these awful scenarios that would happen to me. So I see all these people leaving this old beat-up looking building. I looked and saw a wooden sign that had the name of the bar written on it. Now this just reminded me of a bad horror movie or something. But having made plans and being one to not stand people up, I get out of my car and walk to the front door and go inside. Texted the guy saying, "I'm here, where are you?" Instead of getting a reply like, "Oh, I'm sitting by wherever," I get, "Come inside, I'm here." Like, okay. I know you're here. Odd, I go inside, stand by the door looking for the one person who might be looking toward the door. Finally, this guy sitting at the bar looks at me, and I walk up to him. Bam, it hits me, he looks absolutely nothing like his pictures. Now at this point, I thought just leave, you don't owe it to this guy who lied online any of your time. But I decided to give him the benefit of the doubt, and I went and joined him. We start talking, but he's super shady. He's already eating, and probably had a couple drinks as he was there beforehand with a buddy or something. I explained my situation of the day, and apologized for my mediocre company. To which he was annoyed at, and though I was lying. We didn't end up talking much as he was constantly on his phone and eating, so I ended up just sitting there watching highlights of a basketball game, trying to understand what's going on. He finally puts his phone down and starts saying how I should relax a bit more and have a drink instead of water, that I should share his food with him and also give him a kiss on the cheek. I didn't agree and politely declined each one of his offers, to which he did not take well. He started getting angry toward me and a bit aggressive, pulling on my chair, trying to get my sweater off of me, trying to touch me and so forth. Then he went off to call me snobby, the worst company ever. Mind you, I never have my phone out when I'm on a date to be polite and let them know that they have my full attention, that I'm lazy and not worth his time. At this time he was starting to get a bit more physical, so I finally stood up and told him if that's how he feels he shouldn't contact me anymore, and I was going to go home. I was shaking so much when I was leaving that I had no idea what to do other than to run to my car. Left the bar as fast as I could, calling one of my friends, thinking that he might have had someone waiting outside to kidnap me. Ran to my car, started it, and I was out of that parking lot faster than you can say uncle. It doesn't sound as bad, but he was not the guy I remember talking to or calling. You know, the usual mix of awkward small talk, the occasional spark, and sometimes, when the stars align, a fun night that ends with a bang, or at least the possibility of one. Most of these dates blur together into a hazy montage of cocktails, dimly lit restaurants, and the same recycled questions. What do you do for work? Are you from around here? Do you have siblings? It's safe to say I've had my fair share of hits and misses. But this one was different. It wasn't a horror story, not by any means. It was just bizarre, hilarious, a memory so vivid that it stayed with me long after most of the others have faded. So, she and I had been chatting for about a week. Nothing too intense, just your standard Tinder banter. She was witty, sarcastic. Her profile was very basic. A couple of pictures of her hiking, one where she was laughing with a beer in her hand, and a bio that read, "Will absolutely destroy you in trivia." I liked her immediately. Our conversations were light and fun, and she had this way of roasting me without being mean-spirited about it. It felt natural, like we'd known each other for longer than we actually had. Fast forward to a Sunday night. I was lounging on my couch, scrolling aimlessly through my phone, not expecting much to happen. Then out of nowhere, she messaged me. "Hey, I'm driving through your area on my way home. Wanna hang out?" It was already 10 p.m., but I wasn't about to say no. There's something exciting about the spontaneity of it, right? No formal plans, no overthinking, just a random meetup with someone who seemed cool. So, I told her to come over. About 20 minutes later, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find her standing there, looking effortlessly cute in a hoodie and jeans. She was holding a bag of takeout, and the smell of Mexican food hit me like a truck. "I was starving," she said, holding up the bag like it was a trophy. "Hope you don't mind." I laughed and told her to come in. We settled onto the couch, and I put on an episode of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. A solid choice for breaking the ice without the pressure of having to talk constantly. She opened up the takeout bag, and that's when I realized she wasn't messing around. Inside were a monster bean and cheese burrito and a carne asada quesadilla. I'm not exaggerating when I say the burrito was the size of a small child. It was a unit, and the quesadilla, equally impressive. I wasn't even hungry, but the sheer volume of food made me do a double take. "You want some?" she asked, holding up the quesadilla like an offering. I shook my head, laughing. "Nah, I'm good. I already ate." That's when the show really started. This girl, skinny as hell, for the record, proceeded to absolutely annihilate both the burrito and the quesadilla. I'm talking no hesitation, no slowing down, no mercy. She devoured them like she hadn't seen food in days. It was mesmerizing. I sat there, half watching Always Sunny and half watching her go to town on what had to be at least 2 pounds of Mexican food. It didn't take long either, maybe 10 minutes tops. She was like a machine. A very polite, charming machine, but a machine nonetheless. When she was done, she grabbed a napkin and wiped her face with the kind of casual confidence that only someone who has just performed a Herculean feat of eating can pull off. She crumpled up the wrappers, tossed them back into the takeout bag, and leaned back on the couch like she'd just finished a marathon. I didn't say anything for a moment, partly because I was in awe and partly because I didn't know if anything I said could do justice to what I had just witnessed. "Feel better?" I finally asked, trying not to laugh. "Oh yeah," she said, patting her stomach. "I was starving." That hit the spot, and then, out of nowhere, she reached for my hand. I thought maybe she was going to hold it, or maybe we'd have one of those flirty, subtle hand-touching moments you see in rom-coms. Nope. She took my hand, placed it directly on her chest, and rubbed it over her boobs like it was the most normal thing in the world. I froze, not entirely sure how to react. Was this a move? A joke? Some kind of post-burrito ritual I wasn't aware of? Before I could process what was happening, she stood up, brushed herself off, and said, "Welp, I gotta go." She grabbed her bag of trash, turned to me with a grin, and added, "You can tell your friends you at least got something out of it." And then, just like that, she walked out the door and out of my life. I sat there for a good 5 minutes, trying to wrap my head around what had just happened. I mean, who does that? Who shows up unannounced on a Sunday night, destroys 2 massive portions of Mexican food, rubs someone's hand on their chest, and then pieces out like it's no big deal. It was the most bizarre, hilarious, and oddly impressive date I've ever been on. Here's the thing, I never saw her again. She didn't text me, I didn't text her, and that was that. But to this day, I still think about her sometimes. There was something so unapologetically her about the whole thing. She knew what she wanted, she showed up, she ate her food, and she left on her own terms. It was almost poetic. I've been on plenty of dates since then, some good, some bad, most forgettable. But none of them have come close to that night. She was like a tornado, unexpected, chaotic, and impossible to ignore. And while our time together was brief, it left an impression. Sometimes, when I'm scrolling through Tinder or Hinge, I catch myself wondering if I'll ever cross paths with her again. Maybe she's out there somewhere, leaving a trail of burrito wrappers and confused but charmed men in her wake. One thing's for sure, I'll never look at a carne asada quesadilla the same way again. My Tinder nightmare, or maybe in some ways my Tinder miracle, began on January 8th, 2014. That's when I first started texting with her. She was an absolutely stunning woman. Someone who, without a doubt, was way out of my league. I'm a 50-something Caucasian guy, out of shape, overweight, but otherwise, I'd say I'm pretty normal. Stable. Just your average guy. She, on the other hand, was a 30-year-old black woman, college-educated, elegant, slender, and breathtakingly beautiful. She had this presence about her in her photos, this glow that made her stand out from everyone else. I never expected her to swipe right on me, let alone text back. But somehow there we were, chatting back and forth for a couple of days. She was witty and warm, and even though I was still trying to wrap my head around the fact that she was even interested in talking to me, I decided to take a chance. I invited her to dinner at a very nice restaurant downtown, expecting her to politely decline. To my complete shock, she said yes. I reread her message about 5 times, just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. The night of our date, I got to the restaurant early and grabbed a seat at the bar. I was nervous, no scratch that, I was terrified. Part of me was convinced this was some sort of elaborate prank, that she wouldn't actually show up. I kept checking my watch, my palms sweaty as I ran through a mental checklist of all the ways I could screw this up. But then she walked in. The moment I saw her, my jaw hit the floor. I'm not exaggerating when I say she was one of the most beautiful women I had ever seen in my life. She was taller than me in her heels, wearing this elegant short dress that showed off her impossibly long legs. She had this bright, radiant smile that instantly lit up the room. For a second, I couldn't breathe. I fumbled to stand up and greet her, and somehow managed to stammer out a hello. She hugged me lightly, her perfume filling the air between us, and we were escorted to our table. The date itself was amazing. The conversation flowed effortlessly, like we'd known each other for years. She was funny and intelligent, but also kind in a way that immediately put me at ease. I couldn't believe how comfortable I felt with her. We talked about everything, our lives, our families, our favorite books and movies. I didn't want the night to end, so when I suggested we continue our date at a couple of bars nearby, and she agreed, I felt like I'd just won the lottery. The drinks only made the chemistry between us stronger. We laughed, shared stories, and at one point, I caught myself just staring at her, wondering how on earth I had gotten so lucky. By the end of the night, she said it was time to head home. Since she'd taken an Uber earlier, I offered to give her a ride, and to my surprise, she accepted. As I drove her back to her place, I kept thinking about how surreal the whole evening felt. I didn't have any expectations going into this. Honestly, I thought I'd just end up making a new friend. I mean, let's face it, the differences between us were obvious. I figured she'd had fun, but probably wouldn't see me as anything more than a nice guy to hang out with. But when we pulled up to her place, she lingered for a moment. We talked a little more, and I offered to walk her to her door. She declined, but then she did something I'll never forget. She got out of the car, walked around to my side, leaned through the window, and kissed me. It wasn't just a peck either. It was brief but sensual enough to make my heart stop. When she pulled back, she smiled at me, and I somehow managed to stammer out an invitation to see her again. She said yes without hesitation. I drove home that night feeling like I was floating. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I knew deep down that this woman was going to change my life in some profound way. Over the next couple of weeks, we saw each other almost every day. Things moved fast, but it felt natural. I was already developing strong feelings for her. She had this way of making me feel like the most important person in the world, even when we were just sitting on the couch watching TV or grabbing coffee at a little cafe. But as perfect as everything seemed, I couldn't shake this nagging feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything obvious. She was affectionate, attentive, and seemed genuinely happy to be with me. But there was this undercurrent, this weight, like she was holding something back. Then one night, it all came to a head. We were out at a bar, laughing and having a good time, but I could tell she was distracted. As we were leaving, she turned to me and said, "We need to talk." My stomach dropped. I thought for sure this was the moment she was going to tell me that the differences between us were too much, that she couldn't see a future with me. I braced myself for the friend zone, but what she said next completely blindsided me. She asked me to listen and not say anything until she was finished. I agreed, though my mind was already racing. She started by telling me that she had developed strong feelings for me, but there was something she needed to tell me, something that might make me reconsider pursuing a relationship with her. My mind went into overdrive. Was she married? Did she have a criminal past? Then I remembered something from a few nights earlier. We had been making out, and when I touched her chest, I noticed her breasts felt different. I assumed she had implants, and for a brief, horrifying moment, I wondered if she was about to tell me she was transgender. Not that it would have been a deal breaker, but it would have been a shock. But no, what she told me was something I never could have prepared for. With tears in her eyes, she said, "I have stage 4 breast cancer." I felt like the ground had just been ripped out from under me. She explained that she had been diagnosed 4 years earlier as stage 3 and had undergone a double mastectomy, radiation, and chemotherapy. The cancer had gone into remission for a while, but now it was back. She was scheduled to start chemo again in 2 weeks. She looked at me, her voice steady but vulnerable, and said, "I'll understand if this is too much for you. I wouldn't blame you if you wanted to walk away." I didn't even have to think about my answer. I told her that I adored her, that she was an incredible woman, and that if she wanted me by her side for this journey, I would be honored. We kissed, and then we just held each other for what felt like hours. By the time we said goodnight, I was emotionally drained. I cried all the way home. The next year of my life was both the hardest and the most beautiful year I've ever lived. We packed a lifetime into 2014. She showed me what grace truly meant. Even as she went through chemo, she carried herself with this quiet strength and elegance that left me in awe. She never complained, never let herself feel like a victim. She even made the trip to Japan to visit me while I was there for work, squeezing it in between her treatments. We made the most of every moment we had together, knowing our time might be limited. And when the end finally came, 15 months after we met, I was there with her. Losing her was devastating, but I wouldn't trade the time we had for anything in the world. Jenny, you changed my life. You made me a better man, and I'll carry your memory with me forever. I love you. I miss you. And I'll never forget the incredible, beautiful woman who taught me what it means to truly live. My sophomore year of college was full of questionable decisions, but one story stands out above the rest as the absolute pinnacle of awkwardness, regret, and just plain weirdness. It all started with a girl I'd been talking to on Tinder. She went to a university about an hour away, and we'd been messaging back and forth for a couple of months. She seemed cool. Things were going pretty well, so when she invited me to her 21st birthday party, I figured why not. She made it sound like it was going to be a huge blowout, and she was adamant that I had to come. She even threw in a few, "It wouldn't be the same without you" messages for good measure. I was sold. Now, I wasn't about to roll up to this party alone, so I convinced 2 of my fraternity brothers to come with me. It was a bit of a road trip, but we figured it'd be a fun night, hit up the party, meet some new people, throw back a few drinks, and maybe make some memories. The 3 of us piled into my buddy's car, hyped ourselves up on the way, and rolled into her college town, ready for a wild night. When we got to the address she gave me, I could tell right away that something was off. The house was quiet, like really quiet. No music, no people spilling out onto the lawn, no sign of the big party she'd promised. My friends and I exchanged a few skeptical glances, but I figured maybe everyone was inside, and the party was just getting started. So we knocked on the door. She answered with a big smile, looking really cute in a party dress. I was optimistic for about 0.2 seconds, until I glanced past her and realized the big party was actually just her and her 2 roommates sitting on the couch. No music, no decorations, no drinks, nothing. Just the 3 of them hanging out, like it was a normal Tuesday night. My friends and I stepped inside, trying to mask our confusion, but the awkward vibes hit us like a brick wall. It got worse. Her 2 roommates weren't drinking, weren't going out, and definitely weren't interested in making conversation with us. So it was just me, my Tinder date, and my 2 fraternity brothers awkwardly trying to salvage the night. We tried everything, beer pong, flip cup, quarters, but the birthday girl refused to participate. At one point, she actually said, "Drinking games are illegal." I'm not exaggerating. Those words came out of her mouth. My jaw hit the floor. I was floored. Who says that? Who even thinks that? In that moment, I realized I had made a huge mistake. Realizing we were in the middle of what might be the lamest 21st birthday party of all time, my friends and I decided to call an audible. We hit up our fraternity's chapter at her university, and the guys there were more than happy to have us over. They were throwing an actual party with actual people and actual fun. So, we made plans to head over. Here's where things took another turn. I managed to convince my Tinder date to come with us to the fraternity party, which I thought was a win. Maybe the night could still be saved. But as we were leaving her apartment complex, she saw a cop car parked nearby and completely lost her mind. She started freaking out, saying we were going to get in trouble and insisting we go back to her place. Keep in mind, she had just turned 21, we weren't carrying anything illegal, and there was literally no reason to panic. But she wasn't having it. She was practically shaking, convinced the cops were going to arrest us for walking. At that point, my 2 friends had already started making their way to the fraternity house, and I was stuck. I couldn't just ditch her, since I was supposed to stay at her place that night. So, I reluctantly told my friends to go on without me, and took one for the team. We went back to her apartment. When we got back, I thought maybe we'd have a drink, talk, and salvage the night somehow. Nope. Instead, she put on the Lizzie McGuire movie. I'm not kidding. There I was, sitting on her couch, watching Hilary Duff sing What Dreams Are Made Of while questioning every single decision that had led me to this moment. I was trying to be a good sport about it, though, and eventually things started to heat up a bit. We started making out, and for a brief second I thought, maybe this isn't so bad after all. Wrong. So wrong. Mid-make-out, she stopped and informed me that she was on her period and wouldn't go any further than kissing. Now, don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with setting boundaries. I respect that, but I was already stuck at what felt like the most awkward birthday party ever, and now I was being told that this was as good as it was going to get. I tried to convince her to at least meet me halfway, but she wasn't budging. Instead, she said, "I can do a little trick that'll make you happy." I had no idea what she meant, but curiosity got the better of me. I told her to go for it. Big mistake. She proceeded to lick me. Not in a sexy way. Not in a playful way. No, she licked me from one ear down under my chin, all the way to my other ear. It was the most unsexy, awkward, slobbery thing I have ever experienced in my life. I was stunned. Speechless. I didn't even know how to react. She pulled back, smiled like she'd just done something amazing, and then started doing it again. I told her she could stop, but she didn't. She kept going, licking my face like a dog that had just found peanut butter. I was drenched in slobber. At this point, I was praying for my friends to come back and save me. Hours later, they finally stumbled in, drunk and laughing about the amazing time they'd had at the fraternity party. I shot them a look that said, "We need to leave now." We made our exit as early as we could the next morning, and I thought the nightmare was finally over. Oh, but it wasn't. A few hours after we got back to our university, I got a Snapchat from her. It was a picture of her and her two roommates, holding up a condom that had apparently fallen out of my pocket the night before. They were all smiling like it was some kind of trophy. I just stared at my phone, completely mortified. And it gets even better. Over 2 months later, after absolutely zero contact, she messaged me out of the blue and asked, "So, are we going to be boyfriend/girlfriend or not?" To finalize here, yes, I never replied. And I've never used Tinder again. Dating in the modern world is a series of adventures, mishaps, and awkward moments, all wrapped in the hope of finding someone who makes the chaos worthwhile. Tinder, in particular, has a way of turning your expectations on their head. 1 minute you're swiping and chatting, imagining the fun you'll have, and the next, life throws you a curveball you didn't see coming. That's exactly what happened to me when I met this guy. Let's call him Tinder Guy. Not the most creative nickname, but it suits the story. We hit it off immediately after matching. He was funny, charming, and had this easygoing vibe that made him stand out from the usual Tinder crowd. Our first 2 dates were genuinely a lot of fun. I hadn't really been looking for anything serious, but with him, it felt like there was potential. We laughed a lot, had great conversations, and I felt comfortable around him, which isn't always the case on Tinder dates. By the time our 3rd date rolled around, I was pretty into him. Like really into him. I decided I wanted to take things to the next level. He planned the 3rd date, and it was perfect. He took me to this cute little Italian restaurant that had candles on the tables and dim lighting. The whole romantic setup. We shared a bottle of wine, split a tiramisu for dessert, and everything just felt right. I knew by the time we were halfway through the main course that I wanted to sleep with him that night. And honestly, I thought he might feel the same way. After dinner, he invited me back to his place for another glass of wine, and I didn't hesitate for a second. His apartment was nice, clean, cozy, and full of little personal touches that made it feel like more than just a bachelor pad. He poured us each a glass of red wine, and we settled onto his couch. The conversation flowed as easily as it had all night, and before long we were kissing. At first, it was great. He was a good kisser, and it felt natural, not forced or awkward. But then, the kissing just kept going, fully clothed, making out on the couch, for what felt like an eternity. I'm not exaggerating when I say it lasted forever. At first, I was into it, but after a while, I started to wonder what was going on. We weren't teenagers at a high school party. We were 2 adults who had just come back from a romantic dinner. I was ready to move things forward, but he didn't seem to be getting the hint. After what felt like hours, but was probably more like 30 minutes, I decided to take matters into my own hands. If he wasn't going to make a move, I was. So I stood up, took a deep breath, and took off all of my clothes. Not in a dramatic way, but in a clear, okay, let's do this kind of way. I figured it would be enough to break the tension and let him know I was ready. Instead of reacting the way I expected, he sat up straight, still fully clothed, and looked at me with this serious, almost apologetic expression. I'll never forget what he said next. "I can't have sex with you. I have an STD." Those words hit me like a ton of bricks. For a second, I didn't know how to respond. I was standing there completely naked, and he was just sitting there fully dressed, dropping this bombshell like it was nothing. It was, without a doubt, one of the most awkward moments of my life. I don't even remember what I said at first. Probably something like, "Oh, okay," because what else can you say in a situation like that? I sat back down on the couch and quickly started putting my clothes back on, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. My mind was racing. Part of me was mortified, but another part of me was grateful. I mean, he could have not told me. He could have gone through with it and let me find out later, which would have been a million times worse. The fact that he was upfront about it was, in hindsight, a good thing. But in the moment, it was just incredibly, painfully awkward. I tried to be nice about it. I really did. I told him I appreciated his honesty and that I wasn't upset, but it was clear that the night was over. The vibe had gone from romantic and exciting to uncomfortable and strange in a matter of seconds. I grabbed my bag, gave him a polite goodbye, and left his apartment as quickly as I could without making it seem like I was running away. The whole drive home, I replayed the night in my head, trying to figure out where it had all gone wrong. I mean, I couldn't exactly blame him. It wasn't his fault he had an STD, and I respected him for being honest about it. But I also couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. I'd been so excited for that night, and it had ended in the most awkward way imaginable. When I got home, I texted a couple of my friends to tell them what had happened, and their responses were a mix of shock, laughter, and relief. One of them said, "Well, at least he told you. That's more than a lot of guys would do." And she was right. As awkward as it had been, I was grateful that he'd been upfront with me. It could have gone a lot worse. Dating apps are like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. Sometimes you match with someone, and the connection is like instant. Other times, you end up with a story so surreal it feels like a bad rom-com plotline. This is one of those stories, and let me tell you, it's a real doozy. I live in the Midwest, where people pride themselves on being friendly, down-to-earth, and honest. So when I matched with a girl on Bumble, who seemed like the embodiment of Midwest charm, I was hopeful. Her profile was simple and intriguing, a bright smile, a picture of her hugging a golden retriever, and a bio that read, "Lover of sunsets, road trips, and family dinners." We started chatting, and she was every bit as sweet as her profile suggested. Let's call her Emma, shall we? Emma and I messaged for about a week before setting up a date. Our conversations were easy. She was funny, quick-witted, and had this way of making me feel like she was genuinely interested in what I had to say. We bonded over our shared love of hiking and small-town diners, and before long, I was looking forward to meeting her in person. She suggested a local bar for our first date, a cozy place with live music and great cocktails. I liked that she picked the spot. It showed initiative, and it was a place I'd been meaning to check out anyway. The night of the date, I showed up a little early, nerves buzzing but optimistic. When Emma walked in, I immediately recognized her from her photos. She had the same bright smile, the same warm energy. She was even prettier in person, and I couldn't help but feel like I'd hit the jackpot. We hugged hello, ordered drinks, and settled into a booth near the stage. The first half of the date was great. We talked about everything, our jobs, our families, our favorite books and movies. She told me about her job as a social worker and how rewarding it was to help people, even though it could be emotionally draining. I told her about my weekend hiking trips and my ongoing quest to find the best burger in the city. The conversation flowed easily, and I felt like we were really clicking. But then, halfway through the date, something changed. Emma started glancing at her phone more and more. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe she was checking the time or responding to a quick text. But her expressions grew more serious, and she seemed distracted. I asked if everything was okay, and she gave me a tight smile and said, "Yeah, just a little family thing. Nothing to worry about." I didn't want to pry, so I let it go, but the mood had shifted. She wasn't as engaged in the conversation anymore, and I could tell her mind was elsewhere. Still, I figured maybe she was just having an off moment. Everyone has those, right? About 20 minutes later, she looked at her phone again and suddenly gasped. "Oh no," she said, her voice tinged with panic. "I just got a text from my mom. She's having a medical emergency, and I need to go check on her." I froze for a second, unsure of what to say. "Oh my God, is she okay? Do you need help?" No, it's fine," she said quickly, grabbing her coat and bag. "I just need to get home. I'm so sorry to cut this short." I stood up, still processing what was happening. "Do you want me to drive you? Or call someone for you?" "No, it's okay. I'll call an Uber. Thank you for understanding." And just like that, she was gone. I sat back down, staring at my half-empty glass of beer, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The date had been going so well, and now it was over, just like that. I felt bad for Emma and her mom, but I also couldn't shake the feeling that something about the whole situation felt off. I finished my drink, paid the tab, and left the bar. As I was walking back to my car, still replaying the night in my head, I spotted Emma. She was just a few blocks away, standing under a street lamp. But she wasn't alone. She was with another guy. They were laughing, her arm hooked around his, and there was no sign of the panic or urgency she'd shown just minutes earlier. My stomach dropped. I stopped in my tracks, staring at them from a distance as reality sank in. There wasn't any family emergency. She'd lied to get out of the date. I felt a mix of emotions, embarrassment, anger, confusion. Mostly, though, I just felt stupid. I'd been duped, plain and simple. I debated confronting her, but decided against it. What good would it do? She clearly wasn't interested, and calling her out would only make things more awkward. Instead, I got in my car and drove home, feeling humiliated and defeated. The next day, I told my friends what had happened. Their reactions ranged from outrage to laughter, with one friend joking, "Well, at least she didn't fake her own death." I tried to laugh it off, but it still stung. I thought about texting Emma to call her out, but I decided it wasn't worth the effort. She'd made her choice, and honestly, I didn't want to waste any more time on someone who clearly wasn't honest. A few days later, though, I got a message from her. "Hey, I had such a great time with you the other night. Would love to see you again soon." I stared at the message, dumbfounded. Was she serious? Did she think I hadn't seen her with that other guy? Or was she just hoping I'd forgotten about the whole family emergency thing? I didn't reply. Instead, I deleted the conversation and unmatched her. Looking back, the whole experience was a lesson in trusting my gut. The moment she started acting distracted, I should have known something was up. People don't just suddenly change their demeanor like that without a reason. Dating apps are a wild ride. Sometimes you meet great people, and sometimes you end up with stories like this one. Awkward, frustrating, and a little bit ridiculous. But hey, at least I got a good story out of it. And now, whenever someone mentions a family emergency, I can't help but smile and think, sure, Jan. It began innocently enough. I matched with a guy on Hinge who seemed like the picture-perfect gentleman. He was British, had a sharp sense of humor, and his profile was full of little tidbits about himself. He loved museums, hiking, and cooking. He even had a picture of himself holding a cup of tea while reading, and I'll admit, I swooned just a little. Let's call him Edward. Edward and I hit it off right away. We had long conversations about books, travel, and our favorite cuisines. He had this posh, polite way of texting that made him seem like a character out of a Jane Austen novel. When he asked if I'd like to come over for dinner at his flat, I thought, why not? He seemed trustworthy, and he said he'd cook for me, which sounded romantic. The night of the date, I dressed up a little, feeling both excited and nervous. His flat was in a nice part of town, and when I arrived, he greeted me warmly. He was just as charming in person as he'd been over text, and his flat was immaculate. Minimalist decor, bookshelves lined with classics, and a faint smell of garlic wafting from the kitchen. It felt inviting, like stepping into the home of someone who really had his life together. "Dinner's almost ready," Edward said, leading me to the kitchen. "Make yourself comfortable." I sat at the small dining table while he stirred something on the stove. Everything seemed perfect, until I started to notice the decor. At first, it was subtle. There was a sleek knife block on the counter, which didn't seem unusual. But then I noticed a large display case mounted on the wall, filled with knives. Not just kitchen knives, but all kinds. Hunting knives, daggers, even a few that looked like they belonged in a medieval museum. "Nice collection," I said, gesturing to the display. Edward glanced over his shoulder and smiled. "Ah, yes. It's a bit of a hobby of mine." I nodded, trying not to overthink it. Everyone has hobbies, right? But as I looked around the room, I realized the knives weren't limited to just one display. There was another case on the opposite wall, this one filled with even larger blades, machetes, cleavers, and a sword that looked like it belonged to a Viking. "Wow, you've got quite a collection," I said, trying to keep my tone light and casual. He chuckled. "Yes, I've been collecting knives for years. Each one has a story. Some are antiques, some are from my travels, and a few are custom-made. I think of them as pieces of art." That sounded reasonable enough, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. Something about the sheer number of blades in the room felt excessive. As we sat down to eat, Edward started telling me about the knives. At first, it was interesting. He talked about the craftsmanship and the history behind some of the pieces. But then his tone shifted. He started describing the art of blade work in a way that felt unnervingly intense. "There's something so elegant about a well-balanced knife," he said, holding up his fork like it was a weapon. "The precision, the control, it's an extension of the body, really." I forced a smile and nodded, but my appetite was quickly evaporating. He must have noticed my discomfort because he changed the subject, asking me about my favorite books and films. I tried to steer the conversation to safer ground, but every now and then he'd circle back to the knives, dropping little comments like, "You know, this one blade I have could cut through bone like butter." By the time we finished dinner, I was feeling more than a little uneasy. Edward offered to show me the rest of his flat, and I reluctantly agreed, hoping it would give me a better sense of who he was. The first few rooms were normal, his bedroom, a small office, but when he opened the door to what he called his hobby room, my stomach turned. The room was filled with knives. Display cases lined every wall, and there was even a glass cabinet in the middle of the room with a spotlight shining down on what looked like a ceremonial dagger. There were knives on stands, knives in frames, and knives hanging from hooks. It was overwhelming. "This is my pride and joy," Edward said, gesturing to the room with a wide smile. "Every piece here has been carefully curated. Some of these are extremely rare." I nodded, trying not to let my face betray how freaked out I was. "It's impressive," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer to one of the displays and took out a knife with a long, serrated blade. "This one," he said, holding it up, "was used in combat. It's a replica, of course, but the design is based on a blade that was actually used in World War II. "That's interesting," I said, taking a step back. He turned the knife over in his hands, his eyes gleaming. "You know, there's something almost poetic about the way a blade can cut through anything. It's so final, so precise. Don't you think?" Yeah," I muttered, my heart racing. "I think I should probably head out. It's getting late." Edward looked up, his expression suddenly serious. "Oh, of course. Let me walk you out." I grabbed my bag and followed him to the door, trying to act as casual as possible. As we said goodbye, he leaned in for a hug, and I stiffened. My mind was racing with thoughts of his knife collection, and the way he'd talked about blades like they were living things. When I finally got to my car, I let out a shaky breath and locked the doors. The whole drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about the knives. Was I overreacting? Was he just a passionate collector, or was there something darker beneath the surface? The next day, Edward texted me, saying he'd had a wonderful time and would love to see me again. I stared at the message, my stomach twisting. I didn't know how to tell him that his obsession with knives had freaked me out, so I simply said, "Thanks for dinner, but I don't think we're a good match." He replied with a polite, "No worries. Take care," and I thought that was the end of it. But a week later, I got a package in the mail. There was no return address, but when I opened it, I found a small knife inside. It was a sleek, delicate blade with a note that read, "A gift for someone as sharp as you." I froze, my heart pounding. I had no idea how he'd gotten my address, and I didn't want to find out. I threw the knife in the trash and blocked his number. Looking back, I can't say for sure if Edward was dangerous or just incredibly intense. Maybe he really was just a passionate collector. But when it comes to dating, sometimes your gut knows better than your heart, and my gut was screaming, "Get out." Dating apps can lead you down some strange roads, but nothing prepared me for the absolute nightmare of this Tinder date. It started out like any other match, casual banter, shared hobbies, and some flirty back and forth that made me think this could be something fun. She was a Korean-American woman, absolutely gorgeous, and seemed really laid back. Let's call her Gina. Gina and I had an instant connection over text. We talked about our favorite movies, swapped Spotify playlists, and even joked about how awkward first dates can be. She suggested we meet up at a karaoke bar, and honestly, I loved the idea. It was unique, fun and casual, with none of that staring awkwardly across the table energy that so many first dates have. When the night of the date rolled around, I was feeling good. I arrived at the karaoke bar a few minutes early and grabbed a booth. The place was lively, with groups of friends belting out pop songs and sipping on soju cocktails. It felt like the perfect spot to loosen up and have a good time. When Gina walked in, I was blown away. She looked even better in person, stylish but effortless, with this confident energy that made everyone in the room glance her way. She greeted me with a warm smile, and we immediately hit it off. We ordered drinks, and the conversation flowed like we'd known each other for years. She told me about growing up with strict parents who wanted her to be a doctor, how she rebelled by majoring in art, and her plans to open her own studio someday. I told her about my love of cooking, and how I'd been trying to perfect my kimchi fried rice recipe. She laughed and said she'd be the judge of that someday. Eventually, we decided to start singing. I chose a cheesy 80s ballad, and she picked a K-pop song that she absolutely nailed. We were laughing, clinking glasses, and having the kind of first date that makes you hope there'll be a second. But then things took a turn. After a couple of hours, we were sitting back in the booth, sipping our drinks, when Gina got this faraway look in her eyes. I asked if she was okay, and she hesitated before saying, "There's something I should probably tell you." My stomach did a little flip. That's never a good sign on a first date. "Sure," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. "What's up?" She took a deep breath and said, "My ex-boyfriend left me because he thought I was possessed." I laughed, thinking it was a joke, but her face stayed completely serious. "I'm not kidding," she said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. He said there's something wrong with me, that I have some kind of spirit attached to me. I blinked, not sure how to respond. What do you mean? Like he thought you were haunted or something. She nodded. It started a couple of years ago. Weird things would happen around me, lights flickering, stuff moving. At first, I thought it was just coincidences, but then I started having these episodes. Episodes? I asked, my voice cracking slightly. She looked down at her drink, swirling it around. Sometimes I black out, and when I come to, people tell me I was saying things I don't remember. My ex said my voice changes, like it's not me speaking. I let out a nervous laugh, hoping she'd crack a smile, and tell me this was all some elaborate joke. But she didn't. She just stared at me with those dark, serious eyes, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Are you messing with me right now? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. No, she said firmly. I wish I was. There was an awkward silence, and I was about to suggest we call it a night when it happened. Gina's eyes rolled back in her head, and she let out this guttural, animalistic sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Her body went rigid, and she started muttering under her breath in a voice that didn't sound like hers. I froze, my brain scrambling to figure out what the hell was going on. Was she having a seizure? A panic attack? Was this some kind of prank? Gina, I said, my voice shaky. Are you okay? She didn't respond. Instead, she started speaking louder, but it wasn't in English or Korean for that matter. It was some guttural, raspy language I didn't recognize. Her hands clenched into fists, and her whole body seemed to tremble. I panicked. I looked around the bar, hoping someone might notice and come over to help, but everyone else was too busy singing and laughing to pay attention. Gina, you're scaring me, I said, reaching out to touch her arm. The second I touched her, her head snapped toward me, and her eyes locked onto mine. They didn't look like her eyes anymore. They were cold, almost lifeless. I flinched, pulling my hand back as she let out a low, menacing laugh. And then just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Her body relaxed, and her eyes returned to normal. She blinked a few times, looking confused. What just happened? She asked, her voice soft and shaky. I stared at her, my heart pounding in my chest. You don't remember? She shook her head, looking genuinely concerned. No. Did I have one of my episodes? I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to bolt out of there and never look back, but another part of me felt bad for her. She seemed terrified, like she didn't understand what was happening to her any more than I did. Yeah, I said finally. I think you did. She looked down at her hands, her face pale. I'm so sorry. I told you this would happen. I didn't know what to say. What do you say when your date might be possessed by a spirit? After a few minutes of awkward silence, I suggested we call it a night. She nodded, and I walked her to her car. She apologized again, saying she understood if I didn't want to see her again. I told her to get home safe and watched as she drove away. That was the last time I saw Gina. The next day, she texted me, thanking me for being so understanding and saying she'd had a great time despite what happened. I didn't respond. I didn't know how to. It started when I matched with a French guy on Bumble. His name was Julien, and he had that effortlessly cool vibe that French people seem to be born with. His profile showed him at art galleries, sipping espresso, and posing with a sketchbook. His bio said he was a painter who had just moved to the city to find inspiration. I was intrigued. We started chatting, and he was charming as hell. He called me ma chère, sent me pictures of his artwork, and even quoted poetry at one point. I swooned, obviously. He seemed cultured, interesting, and genuinely sweet. When he asked me if I'd like to meet for coffee, I didn't hesitate to say yes. We decided on a small cafe downtown, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and handwritten menus. I arrived a little early and picked a table near the window. Julien arrived right on time, looking every bit as handsome as his photos. He had this easy confidence about him, like he belonged in a black and white movie. Bonjour, he said, kissing me on both cheeks. You look lovely. I blushed and thanked him, already feeling like this date was off to a great start. He ordered a cappuccino, and we started talking. His accent was thick but melodic, and I found myself leaning forward just to catch every word. He told me about his life in Paris, his love of art, and how he'd moved to the city to escape a breakup and start fresh. It was all very romantic. Then, about 15 minutes into the date, Julien reached down and pulled something out from under the table. At first, I thought it was a bag, but then I saw it, a small cat carrier. Oh, you brought your cat? I said, trying to sound casual. Oui, he said with a smile. This is Clementine. She goes everywhere with me. I peered into the carrier and saw a fluffy orange tabby staring back at me. She looked unimpressed, as cats tend to do. She's adorable, I said, though I was a little thrown off. I mean, who brings a cat on a date? Julian opened the carrier and lifted Clementine out, placing her gently on the table. She stretched, yawned, and then sat down like she owned the place. Julian started feeding her bits of croissant, murmuring to her in French. She loves croissant, he said, smiling at me like this was completely normal. I laughed nervously. She seems very sophisticated. Ah yes, he said, stroking her fur. She is my muse, my little companion. I could not live without her. At this point, I wasn't sure what to think. On one hand, it was kind of sweet how much he loved his cat. On the other hand, it was a little much. But I decided to roll with it. Maybe this was just a quirky French thing. The conversation shifted back to art, and I started to relax again, until Clementine sneezed. Julian immediately pulled out a monogrammed handkerchief and wiped her nose. Oh, ma pauvre Clementine, he cooed. Are you feeling unwell? He looked genuinely distressed, and for a second, I wondered if we were about to leave so he could take her to the vet. But Clementine seemed fine. She stretched again and hopped onto Julian's lap, where she promptly fell asleep. She is my heart, Julian said, looking down at her with a dreamy expression. That's really sweet, I said, though I was starting to feel like a third wheel on my own date. Julian spent the next 10 minutes telling me all about Clementine, her favorite foods, her dislikes, her emotional health. He barely asked me anything about myself, and any time I tried to steer the conversation back to something else, he'd find a way to bring it back to the cat. I think she was a painter in a past life, he said at one point. She has such an artistic soul. I nodded, not sure how to respond. When the waiter came by to clear our plates, Julian asked if they had a small bowl of cream for Clementine. The waiter looked confused but said he'd check. At this point, I was starting to wonder if this was some kind of elaborate prank. Julian seemed so normal over text, but in person, it was like he and Clementine were in their own little world, and I was just a spectator. When the waiter returned with a small bowl of cream, Julian placed it on the table and watched lovingly as Clementine lapped it up. She is such a delicate eater, he said, beaming. Yeah, she's very refined, I said, forcing a smile. By the time the date was over, I was mentally exhausted. Julian walked me to my car, Clementine back in her carrier, and asked if I'd like to see him again. I'll think about it, I said, which was my polite way of saying no. The next day, Julian texted me a picture of Clementine with the caption, "She misses you already." I didn't respond. Look, I love animals as much as the next person, but there's a line between being a pet lover and being a little too attached. Julian was clearly on the other side of that line, and as sweet as he was, I couldn't imagine dating someone whose entire world revolved around their cat. I had matched up with this guy on Hinge, who seemed like a total catch. His name was Rahul. He was Indian American, had a great smile, and his profile was full of things that made him seem like the kind of guy you'd want to bring home to meet your family. He described himself as an entrepreneur, world traveler, and foodie. In one of his pictures, he was skydiving, and in another, he was holding a puppy. Basically, he hit all the right notes for me. Rahul was quick to message me, and he made a great first impression. He was confident but not cocky, funny without trying too hard, and genuinely seemed interested in getting to know me. We talked about our favorite cuisines, our love of travel, and even bonded over how both of our parents had tried to set us up with someone from their friend's family, at least once. For our first date, Rahul suggested dinner at a high-end restaurant downtown. I was impressed. Most of my dating app matches would suggest grabbing coffee or drinks, but Rahul wanted to go all out. I figured he must be serious, and I liked that. The night of the date, I dressed up a little more than usual, feeling excited and maybe even a bit nervous. When I arrived at the restaurant, Rahul was already there, waiting for me at the bar. He stood up as I walked in, greeted me with a warm smile, and complimented my outfit. He was just as handsome as his pictures, and his energy was infectious. We were seated at a cozy table, and from the start, the conversation was easy. He told me about his work, how he'd started his own business, and how it had given him the freedom to travel and live life on his own terms. I was intrigued. Who doesn't love an ambitious guy? As the appetizers arrived, Rahul started asking me about my goals. "What do you want out of life?" he asked, his tone serious but encouraging. It felt like an interview question, but I went along with it, telling him about my career aspirations and my dream of traveling to South America someday. He listened intently, nodding and smiling, and I felt like he genuinely cared about what I had to say. Then, somewhere between the appetizers and the main course, the conversation took a weird turn. "You know," Rahul said, leaning forward, "I think you have a lot of potential." I blinked, confused. Thanks." "No, I mean it," he said, his eyes lighting up. "You seem like someone who's ambitious, who wants more out of life." "Am I right?" "I guess so," I said, feeling a little unsure of where this was going. "That's exactly the kind of mindset I look for in people," he said, his tone growing more intense. "Have you ever thought about starting your own business?" I laughed nervously. "Not really. I'm pretty happy with my job." "That's the thing," he said, lowering his voice like he was about to tell me a secret. "Most people think they're happy, but they're stuck in this cycle, working for someone else, trading their time for money, never really building anything of their own. Don't you want more than that?" At this point, alarm bells started ringing in my head. I had a sinking feeling about where this was going, but I decided to play along to see if I was right. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to sound curious. Rahul smiled, like he'd been waiting for me to ask. "I'm part of an amazing business opportunity," he said, pulling out his phone. "It's changed my life, and I think it could change yours too." He opened an app and started showing me a slideshow. Yes, an actual slideshow about a multi-level marketing company he was involved in. He called it a network of entrepreneurs who were unlocking financial freedom by selling health and wellness products. "It's not just about the products," he said, his voice brimming with enthusiasm. "It's about building a team, empowering others, and creating passive income. The best part? You can do it all from your phone." I stared at him, dumbfounded. Was this really happening? Was I actually on a date with someone who was trying to recruit me into an MLM? "That's interesting," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "It is," he said, mistaking my politeness for genuine interest. "I started just a year ago, and now I'm making more money than I ever did at my old job. And the people I've met, they're like family. It's not just a business, it's a lifestyle." He kept going, showing me pictures of luxury cars, exotic vacations, and smiling groups of people who were apparently all part of this amazing opportunity. I tried to steer the conversation back to normal date topics, but Rahul wasn't having it. He was on a roll, and nothing I said could stop him. By the time dessert arrived, I was mentally exhausted. I'd gone from being excited about the date to wanting to crawl under the table and disappear. "So," Rahul said, flashing me a confident smile, "what do you think? Are you ready to take control of your future?" I took a deep breath, trying to figure out the nicest way to say no. "I think it's great that you're passionate about this," I said carefully, "but I don't think it's for me." Rahul's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "That's okay," he said. "I get it, it's a lot to take in, but I really think you'd be amazing at this. How about we set up a call with my mentor? He can explain it better than I can." I wanted to scream. Instead, I forced a smile and said, "I'll think about it." After the date, I went home and immediately blocked Rahul on Hinge. But he wasn't done with me yet. The next day, he sent me a text. "Hey, just wanted to follow up. I really think you'd be a great fit for the team. Let me know if you'd like to chat more about it." I didn't respond. A week later, I got another text. "I hope you're doing well. Just wanted to remind you that the door is always open if you're ready to change your life." At that point, I blocked his number. Looking back, I can't believe I didn't see the red flags sooner. Rahul was charming, sure, but the moment he started talking about unlocking financial freedom, I should have known something was up. Lesson learned. If someone on a dating app seems too good to be true, they might just be trying to sell you something. I matched with a Mexican-American woman on Tinder named Isabel. She was absolutely stunning, with long dark hair, striking hazel eyes, you name it. Perfect, right? Hold on to that thought, please. We started chatting, and she was hilarious, effortlessly funny in a way that had me grinning at my phone like a fool. She told me she worked as a graphic designer, loved live music, and had a soft spot for dive bars with good margaritas. I was hooked. After a week of chatting, we decided to meet up at one of her favorite spots, a cozy bar with dim lighting, loud music, and a laid-back vibe. The night of the date, I was nervous but excited. When Isabel walked in, she looked even better in person, confident, stylish, and radiating that kind of energy that makes everyone in the room notice. We hugged, ordered drinks, and slid into a booth. From the start, we hit it off. The conversation flowed effortlessly, and she had this way of making me feel like I was the funniest guy in the world. We talked about everything, our favorite bands, bad movies we secretly loved, and the best tacos in the city. She told me a hilarious story about trying to teach her dog to skateboard, and I couldn't stop laughing. For a moment, I thought this might actually be going somewhere. But then, out of nowhere, the night took a turn. We were halfway through our second round of drinks when a guy stormed into the bar, his face twisted in anger. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and looked like he'd just walked off the set of a soap opera. His eyes scanned the room like he was searching for someone, and when they landed on Isabel, his expression darkened. "Isabel," he barked, his voice loud enough to cut through the music. I froze, my drink halfway to my mouth. Isabel stiffened, her smile vanishing. "Oh no," she muttered under her breath. Before I could ask what was going on, the guy stomped over to our booth, glaring at me like I'd just insulted his entire family. "Who the hell is this?" he demanded, jerking his thumb in my direction. "Carlos, what are you doing here?" Isabel said, her voice sharp but controlled. What are you doing here, me?" he shot back. "I saw your post on Instagram. You think you can just move on like that? With this guy?" He jabbed a finger at me, and I suddenly felt like I'd wandered into someone else's drama. "Look, man," I said, trying to stay calm. "I don't know what this is about, but maybe we should all just—" "Shut up," Carlos snapped, cutting me off. "This has nothing to do with you." At this point, people in the bar were starting to notice. The bartender was eyeing us warily, and I could feel the weight of everyone's stares. "Carlos, you need to leave," Isabel said firmly. "We're done, okay? This isn't your business anymore." "Oh, it's my business," he said, leaning closer to the table. His gaze flicked to me, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can just replace me? After everything we went through?" "I'm not doing this with you," Isabel said, standing up. "Go home." Carlos ignored her, his anger now fully focused on me. "You think you're better than me?" he said, his voice rising. "You think you can just walk in and take what's mine?" "Okay, first of all," I said, standing up as well, "I'm not taking anything. You need to calm down." "Big mistake." Carlos lunged at me, and before I knew it, we were nose to nose. For a second, I thought he was going to punch me, but the bartender intervened just in time. "Hey!" the bartender shouted, stepping between us. "Take it outside or take it home. Either way, you're done here." Carlos glared at me one last time before turning to Isabel. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and threatening. Then he stormed out of the bar, leaving a trail of tension in his wake. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and sat back down, my heart racing. Isabel looked mortified. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think he'd actually show up." "What the hell was that?" I asked, trying to process what had just happened. "That was my ex," she said, rubbing her temples. "We broke up a few months ago, but he's not handling it well." "No kidding," I said, glancing toward the door as if Carlos might come back at any second. "I thought he'd moved on," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't think he'd still be keeping tabs on me." I didn't know what to say. Part of me felt bad for her. Clearly, she hadn't asked for this. But another part of me was wondering what kind of baggage I'd just stumbled into. "Maybe we should call it a night," I said finally. She nodded, looking genuinely upset. "Yeah, that's probably a good idea." I walked her to her car, constantly glancing over my shoulder to make sure Carlos wasn't lurking in the shadows. She apologized again, saying she understood if I didn't want to see her again. I told her to stay safe and drove home, still shaken by the whole ordeal. The next day, Isabel texted me to apologize again. She said she'd filed a restraining order against Carlos and promised that he wouldn't be a problem anymore. I wished her the best, but I didn't respond. As much as I liked her, I wasn't ready to dive into that kind of drama. I matched with a Scandinavian guy on Bumble named Eric. He had pics of him hiking through snowy mountains, lounging by a bonfire, and holding what looked like a giant fish he'd caught on a fishing trip. His bio was short and to the point. Adventurer. Amateur chef. Looking for someone to make me laugh. We started chatting, and he was sweet and cool and a little cocky. He told me about his job as a software engineer, his love of the outdoors, and how he'd recently moved to the city to experience something new. He also mentioned that he was still adjusting to life in a tiny apartment after growing up with endless space back home in Norway. After a week of messaging, Eric asked if I'd like to come over for dinner. He said he loved cooking for people and wanted to show off his amazing salmon recipe. I was hesitant about going to his place for a first date, but he assured me it would be casual and low pressure. Plus, The idea of being cooked for by a Viking chef was strangely appealing. The night of the date, I showed up at his apartment building, feeling a mix of excitement and nerves. He buzzed me in, and when I walked into his unit, I was immediately impressed. The place was small but cozy, with minimalist Scandinavian decor, lots of light wood, neutral tones, and candles. It looked like something out of a home design magazine. "Welcome," Eric said, flashing me a warm smile. He was wearing an apron and holding a wooden spoon, which was somehow both adorable and very attractive. The smell of roasted salmon and fresh dill filled the air, and I could hear soft jazz playing in the background. It felt so comfortable, like he'd put real effort into making the evening special. "Wow, this is amazing," I said, taking off my coat. "Thank you," he said. "Make yourself at home. Dinner's almost ready." As I settled onto the couch, I heard a door creak open behind me. I turned around just in time to see a man step out of one of the bedrooms. He was about the same age as Eric, wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt, and had the kind of bedhead that suggested he'd just woken up from a nap. "Oh hey," he said, rubbing his eyes. "You must be Eric's date." Before I could respond, Eric poked his head out of the kitchen. "Oh yeah, this is Oscar. He's my roommate." Oscar plopped down in the armchair across from me, grinning like we were old friends. "Nice to meet you. So, where are you from?" I glanced at Eric, who looked a little sheepish. Nice to meet you too," I said, trying to hide my confusion. "I'm from here, actually." Oscar nodded, then leaned forward like he was about to interview me. "What do you do for work? How did you and Eric meet? Are you into hiking, or is that just his thing?" Before I could answer, Eric appeared with 2 glasses of wine. "Oscar, don't you have something to do?" he asked, his tone light but pointed. Oscar shrugged. "Not really. I was just going to hang out. Is that okay?" I smiled awkwardly, unsure of what to say. Eric shot me an apologetic look and handed me a glass of wine before disappearing back into the kitchen. For the next 10 minutes, Oscar peppered me with questions about my job, my hobbies, my family, even my favorite Netflix shows. He wasn't mean or rude, but his energy was overwhelming. I felt like I was being interrogated by someone who was trying way too hard to be my best friend. Finally, Eric called us to the table, and I thought, great, maybe Oscar will go do something else now. But no, he pulled up a chair and joined us, as if it were completely normal for a roommate to third wheel a first date. "Wow, this looks amazing," I said, trying to focus on the food. "Thanks," Eric said, smiling at me. "I hope you like salmon." Before I could take a bite, Oscar chimed in. "Oh, you're in for a treat. Eric makes the best salmon. He learned the recipe from his grandmother. Right, Eric?" Eric nodded, clearly trying to keep his cool. "Yeah, that's right. It's a family recipe." Oscar launched into a story about the time Eric had tried to cook the same dish for a group of friends and accidentally set off the fire alarm. Eric laughed nervously, but I could tell he was getting frustrated. As the meal went on, Oscar continued to dominate the conversation. He told me about his job, his recent breakup, and his plans to adopt a dog. He even started giving me fun facts about Eric, like how he's afraid of spiders and once got lost in the woods for 6 hours during a camping trip. At one point, Eric tried to steer the conversation back to me, asking about my favorite travel destinations. But before I could answer, Oscar jumped in with a story about his trip to Iceland. By the time we finished dinner, I was mentally drained. Eric offered to walk me to my car, and I eagerly accepted, grateful for the chance to escape Oscar's relentless chatter. As we walked outside, Eric sighed. "I'm so sorry about Oscar. He's a lot." "It's okay," I said, smiling weakly. "He seems nice." Eric groaned. "He's a good guy, but he doesn't know how to give people space." I told him I had a date tonight, but I guess he didn't take the hint. I nodded, unsure of what to say. Eric was great, handsome, sweet, and genuinely interesting, but the thought of dealing with Oscar on a regular basis was daunting. When we reached my car, Eric asked if I'd like to go out again. I hesitated for a moment before saying, "Maybe. Let me think about it." He smiled, looking a little disappointed but understanding. "Of course. Take your time." We said goodbye, and I drove home, replaying the night in my head. As much as I liked Eric, I couldn't shake the feeling that Oscar would always be there, lurking in the background like an overzealous chaperone. The next day, Eric texted me to apologize again for Oscar's behavior. I told him it was fine, but I didn't think we were a good match. He was polite and understanding, and we wished each other the best. I matched with a Chinese-American guy called Kevin on the one and only Hinge. His bio included things like, "I'll never say no to dumplings," and "looking for someone to join me on my search for the best boba in town." It was just what I was looking for. We hit it off pretty quickly. Our conversations were light-hearted, full of joking about how we'd both probably spend way too much money on bubble tea if left unchecked. He told me about his job in marketing, his love of cooking, and his favorite hidden gem restaurants in the city. He seemed down to earth, and I liked that. After a week of chatting, we decided to meet up for tea at a cute little shop he recommended. It sounded like the perfect first date, low-key, casual, and in public, just in case. The tea shop was cozy, with warm lighting and shelves full of exotic-looking teapots. When Kevin walked in, I immediately recognized him from his pictures. He was a little taller than I'd expected, with an easy smile and a nervous energy that felt kind of endearing. We hugged awkwardly, ordered our drinks, and found a small table near the window. At first, the date was great. Kevin was funny and self-deprecating in a way that made me feel comfortable. We talked about our favorite foods, our travel dreams, and the absurdity of dating apps. He told me about his family, how his mom was obsessed with sending him helpful articles about how to find a wife, and I laughed, sharing how my own parents constantly asked if I was seeing anyone special. But then, about halfway through the date, the vibe shifted. We were sipping our drinks when Kevin leaned forward, his expression more serious than it had been all evening. "I feel like I need to tell you something," he said, his voice low. I blinked, caught off guard. "Okay, what's up?" He hesitated for a moment, then said, "So my ex-girlfriend and I just broke up a few months ago." That wasn't exactly a bombshell. Most people on dating apps are fresh out of relationships. "Okay," I said, nodding. "That's pretty normal." "No, but she left me for someone else," he said, his voice tightening. "It was brutal. She just moved on like I didn't matter." I frowned, unsure of how to respond. "I'm sorry to hear that. That must have been really hard." "Yeah," Kevin said, staring into his tea. "It was. But you know what? I'm over it now. I'm ready to move on." "Good for you," I said, genuinely happy for him. "Breakups can be rough, but it's great that you're in a better place now." He nodded, then looked up at me with an intensity that made me feel a little uneasy. "I actually picked this tea shop for a reason," he said. "Oh," I asked, glancing around. "Why's that?" Kevin hesitated, then said, "My ex comes here all the time." My stomach sank. "Wait, what?" "She loves this place," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. I figured there was a chance she might see us here together. I froze, staring at him in disbelief. "You planned this so your ex might see us?" Kevin shrugged, like it wasn't a big deal. "I just thought it would be good for her to see that I'm moving on, you know? Like, let her know that I'm doing fine without her." I didn't even know how to respond. Part of me was stunned that he'd actually admitted to it, and another part of me was furious that I'd unknowingly been dragged into his weird revenge plot. "Kevin," I said slowly, "are you serious right now?" "What?" he asked, looking genuinely confused. "It's not a big deal. I mean, you're amazing, and I thought it'd be nice to show her what she's missing out on." I stared at him, my brain scrambling to process what was happening. "You didn't think to maybe mention this before we went on a date?" "It's not like I planned it to hurt you," he said, his tone defensive. "I just wanted her to see that I'm happy, that I've moved on." "Kevin," I said, my voice sharp, "this is insane. You don't just use someone to make your ex jealous. That's not fair to me." "I wasn't trying to use you," he said quickly. I thought it might help me move on, you know? Like closure." "Closure?" I repeated, my voice rising. "How exactly is this closure? What if she shows up? Do you want her to see us together so she can feel bad? What's the end game here?" Kevin opened his mouth to respond, but I cut him off. "Never mind," I said, standing up. "I don't want to know. I'm done." "Wait," he said, scrambling to his feet. "I'm sorry, okay? I didn't mean to upset you. Good luck with your closure," I said, grabbing my bag. "But I'm not going to be part of it." I left the tea shop without looking back, furious and embarrassed. What started as a fun, low-key date had turned into one of the most ridiculous situations I'd ever found myself in. Kevin texted me later that night, apologizing and saying he'd misjudged things. He asked if I'd be willing to give him another chance, promising that he wouldn't let his ex get in the way this time. I didn't respond. I'll admit it, I ignored a lot of red flags on this one. Like a lot. Looking back, I'm not sure if I was just bored, lonely, or too blinded by lust to connect the dots. But I ended up walking straight into one of the most unhinged situations of my life, And, well, let this be a cautionary tale for anyone who thinks they can just ride it out when the warning signs are practically screaming at them. It all started when I met Amanda on a dating app. Her profile was bold, pictures of her covered in tattoos, including a few that were undeniably edgy. One in particular stood out, the word daddy tattooed, not once, but twice on different parts of her body. I know, red flag number one. But at the time, I thought it was kind of hot in that bad decisions make good stories kind of way. Her bio said she was mostly a lesbian but open to fun, which should have been red flag number two, but again, I ignored it. She messaged me first, and her energy was magnetic, flirty, confident, and refreshingly blunt. She made it clear that she wasn't looking for anything serious, just a good time. I figured why not? We decided to meet up a few nights later at a bar downtown. When Amanda walked in, she was exactly how she described herself, wild, tattooed, and unapologetically sexy. She had this carefree attitude that made her impossible to look away from. We hit it off immediately, laughing over drinks and trading sarcastic jokes. Honestly, it was one of the better first meetups I'd had in a while. By the end of the night, it was clear what was going to happen next. We went back to my place, things heated up quickly, and well, one thing led to another. Afterward, we fell asleep pretty early, probably around midnight or so. When I woke up around 3 in the morning, I noticed she wasn't in bed. I got up to check, thinking maybe she was in the bathroom or something, but nope, she was gone. No text, no note, no goodbye. Red flag number 3. I figured, whatever, maybe that's just her thing. No big deal. And honestly, I didn't give it much thought after that. But about a week later, Amanda called me out of the blue. She wanted to come over again. I hesitated for a second, remembering her vanishing act, but she sounded so casual and fun on the phone that I figured it couldn't hurt. That night, she came over, and things started off just like before. Easy conversation, casual vibes, no pressure. But when things got intimate, she made a request that caught me off guard. Don't look me in the eyes. At first, I thought she was joking. I laughed and said, okay, sure, but she stared at me dead serious and said, no, I mean it. Don't look at me. Red flag number 4. I decided not to make a big deal out of it. Everyone has their quirks, right? So I went along with it. But the vibe was definitely different. It felt a little like she was somewhere else entirely, emotionally shutting me out while still being physically present. Afterward, she stayed for a bit, but there was this strange tension, like she was keeping me at arm's length even though she was the one who came over in the first place. The next time we hooked up, things got even weirder. Right before we started, she flat out told me, let's only do it doggy style. I don't want you looking at me at all. Red flag number 5. At this point, I wasn't sure why I was still going along with this. Maybe I was too curious or too caught up in her magnetic, chaotic energy to just walk away. But I agreed, and it became a pattern. She'd call or text, come over, and make the same requests. No eye contact, no positions where I could see her face. It was like she wanted to completely disconnect from the experience. After a few weeks of this, I started to feel uneasy about the whole situation. I wasn't sure what her deal was, but it was clear that there was something she wasn't telling me. I decided to put a little distance between us, figuring she'd take the hint. That's when my roommate Jake dropped a bomb on me. Wait, you're hooking up with Amanda? He asked one night when I casually mentioned her name. Yeah, why? I said, instantly suspicious of his tone. Jake gave me a look. Dude, I know her. She's from my hometown. She's unhinged. Red flag number 6. What do you mean? I asked, suddenly feeling like I was in way over my head. She has a reputation, Jake said, lowering his voice. She's known for losing it on people. Like full-on destroying people's property if she doesn't get her way. One guy she dated had his car keyed and all his clothes burned after they broke up. Red flag number 7. I sat there, processing what he'd just told me. On one hand, it made sense. She definitely had a chaotic vibe about her. On the other hand, I wasn't sure what to do with this information. Should I cut things off completely? Would that just make things worse? I decided to play it cool and slowly start distancing myself from Amanda. But Amanda wasn't having it. When I stopped responding to her texts right away, she started texting more. And when I didn't give her the attention she wanted, she sent walls of texts, paragraph after paragraph, about how I was disrespecting her as a woman, and how she wasn't just a piece of meat. Red flag numbers 8 and 9. She left me voice messages, 2 long, rambling ones where her tone would swing wildly from angry to tearful. In one, she called me a coward for not being honest with her. In another, she accused me of leading her on and playing with her emotions. It was confusing and exhausting, especially considering she'd made it clear from the start that she wasn't looking for anything serious. The final straw came when she showed up at my apartment unannounced. I was home alone, and when I heard the knock on the door, I had a sinking feeling it was her. Sure enough, there she was, standing in the hallway with this intense look in her eyes. "Hey," she said, her voice sharp. "Why have you been ignoring me?" "I haven't been ignoring you," I said, trying to keep my cool. "I've just been busy." "Bullshit," she snapped. "You've been avoiding me, and I deserve to know why." At that point, I realized there was no way to diffuse the situation without making it worse. I told her I needed space, and that things weren't working out. She just stared at me for a moment, her expression unreadable, before turning on her heel and storming off. I didn't hear from her for a few days, which made me think that maybe, just maybe, she'd moved on. But then the text started again. More walls of text, more accusations, more emotional whiplash. I ended up blocking her number and deleting her from every app one could think of. I've had some strange and uncomfortable experiences with dating apps, but this one takes the cake. It started out fairly normal, just two people chatting, enjoying some good vibes, and planning to meet up. But by the end of it, I found myself checking over my shoulder every time I left my house. Looking back, I wish I had seen the warning signs sooner. I matched with a woman named Sophie on Bumble. Sophie came across as someone who wasn't just looking for a hookup, which I appreciated, had too many of these types in the past which I did not want again. I wasn't necessarily trying to find my soulmate, but I also wasn't interested in something purely casual at the time. We started chatting, and Sophie was great to talk to, and after a couple of days of texting, she suggested meeting up for coffee at Starbucks. I was in. We met at a cute little cafe not too far from where I lived. Sophie looked just like her pictures, and she had this bubbly energy that immediately put me at ease. We talked about our favorite books, our dream travel destinations, and our mutual disdain for pineapple on pizza. She was charming and easy to talk to, and I left the date thinking it had gone really well. Over the next week, we kept texting, and Sophie seemed even more interested in me than I'd expected. She'd send me long, excited messages about her day, ask about mine, and suggest new places we could go together. At first, I was flattered. It's nice to feel wanted, and Sophie really seemed to be into me. But then it started to feel a little overwhelming. She'd text me constantly, morning, afternoon, night. If I didn't respond within an hour, she'd send follow-up messages. "Hey, are you okay? Or did I say something wrong?" I tried to brush it off as enthusiasm, but it was starting to feel like she was expecting way more of my time and attention than I could reasonably give. The second date came around, and we met up for a walk in the park. It was pleasant enough, but Sophie kept dropping little comments that felt oddly intense for someone I'd only just started seeing. She'd say things like, "I feel like I can really be myself around you," or "I think we have something really special." I smiled and nodded along, but in the back of my head, I was thinking, we've only been on 2 dates. How can you feel that way already? After that, things escalated quickly. She started showing up at places where I happened to be, my favorite coffee shop, the gym, even the grocery store. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but then it happened again, and again. One day, I was at the gym when I noticed Sophie on the treadmill a few rows away. She wasn't wearing workout clothes, she was just walking casually, staring at her phone. I waved, trying to keep things light, and she came over immediately. "Hey, fancy seeing you here," she said, grinning. "Yeah, hey," I said, glancing at the weights in my hands. "You work out here too?" "Not really," she said, shrugging. "I was just in the neighborhood and thought I'd drop by." It felt weird, but I didn't want to make a scene, so I just nodded and went back to my workout. But after that, it seemed like Sophie was always in the neighborhood. The breaking point came when I was at a friend's party. It was a small gathering, just a handful of people hanging out and playing board games. I hadn't told Sophie about it, so I was completely shocked when she walked through the door halfway through the night. "Hey," she said, smiling like it was the most normal thing in the world. My friends exchanged confused glances as I pulled Sophie aside. "What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice low. "Oh, I saw your Instagram story," she said casually. "I figured I'd come by and say hi." I hadn't even thought to check who'd viewed my story, but apparently, Sophie had been keeping close tabs on me. "This is a private party," I said, trying to keep my cool. "You can't just show up uninvited." She looked hurt. "I thought you'd be happy to see me." "I didn't invite you," I said firmly. You need to leave. She stared at me for a moment, then turned and walked out without another word. I spent the rest of the night trying to explain to my friends what had just happened. After that, I stopped responding to Sophie's messages. I thought she'd get the hint and move on, but instead she doubled down. She started leaving voicemails, some of them angry, others tearful. She'd say things like, "I don't understand why you're ignoring me. I thought we had something real. And you're not even giving me a chance to explain myself." One night, I came home to find a handwritten note taped to my door. It said, "I'm sorry if I scared you. I just want to talk. Please call me." That was the last straw. I blocked her number, deleted her from every social media platform, and made sure my Instagram stories were set to private. For weeks, I felt like I was looking over my shoulder every time I left the house. I never saw Sophie again, but the whole experience left me shaken.